What's up, YouTube channel? Long time no see. Even though I just published a video recently, a new vlog, but since only a few people have seen it so far, it's irrelevant. Yeah, this is a video I've been wanting to make for a long time. I've been kind of throwing around in my brain for like about a year now, like what I was gonna structure this like, and at one point I decided like, you know, fuck all the like fancy bullshit. Like, I would love to make some kind of infographics, like slideshow type thing, but like, I just would rather be the like talking head kind of persona for this one. I decided like I'll use the green screen and make it look kind of fancy and have some graphics overhead if I feel like doing it. But nonetheless, you know, here I am in my video. I wanted to talk specifically about the subgenre of punk rock known as post-hardcore, given that this has been one of my biggest special interest and hyperfixations in general for a little over a decade now, really. And to prove it to you, if anyone needed it, this is like a little journal I had in high school, and like I filled in like each like decade and like which bands came from what decade, and there's probably around 200 or so bands in this list last time I counted. But since then, of course, I have learned about plentiful other artists in the genre. I came into this genre pretty quickly after like starting to get into music, as you know, I had learned some of these bands from Kurt Cobain's recommendations as I was like at first like really heavily into Nirvana. But I think it was like Christmas of 2013 or 2014 that I stumbled across "And Casino Out" by At the Drive-In that started my like obsession with this genre and this band in particular. Aside from being into the genre since then, I've also been in a number of bands that had influence from these array of sounds, as well as being in a band right now called Swallow These City Lights that's pretty explicitly post-hardcore screamo math rock type of band. These are my qualifications, so I hope that you'll trust my knowledge in this video. So what makes something post-hardcore, you might ask? Well, it's kind of hard to say. Like other genres, as one that like is heavily reliant upon the context in which people are making music. You know, but in general, it can just mean like bands that deviate and take influence from hardcore punk, you know, and they might take it in directions of more introspective lyricism or slowing down the tempo, or adding in influence from other genres like funk or disco or regional folk styles or whatever, you know. It's pretty much limitless as much as bands want to experiment with moving hardcore out of the rah 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 kind of like, you know, breakneck speeds and four on the floor pounding drums, the shouted lyrics, the formulas of hardcore, and something can be considered post-hardcore while being pretty close to these confines. Case in point being even that some of the original bands in the hardcore movement, like Black Flag and Bad Brains and Dead Kennedys, had songs that could be considered post-hardcore because of their willingness to branch out of these restrictive formulas. But that's getting a little too ahead of myself. Our story begins not so long after punk rock does itself, in the late 70s, right? This was a time of huge political unrest. You had like the Cold War happening. A lot of punk rock was defined by its nihilistic attitude and its like in-your-face, apathetic at times, but it really depended on the group. And you had two different camps happening around this time. You had the more aggressive punk rock bands that, also had like a lot of range, from Ramones to Sex Pistols. Like, there was quite a bit of like topics covered and tone and attitude. But distinct from the punk rock movement and its harkening back to more straightforward rock and roll instrumentals, you had the artsier post-punk movement, and these two scenes existed in tandem, and influenced each other, and like there's bands that did like a lot of both, because genres don't exist in a vacuum, and sound travels, influence travels, whatever. You pretty much had these more aggressive punk rock bands, and then the artsier post-punk bands that had what I've heard people describe as like skeletal instrumentation, where it's like kind of bare bones, bass driven, sometimes a lot quieter and less aggressive, at times even noisier than regular punk. Like it's really just like kind of art house punk, a lot of the time. And even some of the earliest punk bands like Television exhibited this like decorative approach to music that was still nonetheless challenging to social norms and listener expectations. So that's what made up post-punk and punk rock, right? I'd say that post-hardcore started to define itself also around this time, even as hardcore was coming up, because you have to think that punk rock and post-punk developed simultaneously, and so did post-hardcore and hardcore. It's like the yin and yang situation. Bands like MX80 Sound, who were massively influential for the movement, they had a lot of strange instrumentation, a lot of like time signature experimentation. They had this aggressiveness that could be likened to hardcore at the time. And a lot of bands throughout the 80s will call MX80 Sound like a huge influence on what post-hardcore would become. You also had influential stuff like some of the songs on Public Image Limited's debut album. While they're not like necessarily a post-hardcore band, they do have songs that could like be lumped in with that sound. Specifically like the opener of First Issue. You also had a band called The Pack that had a single called Heathen Brave New Soldiers that was a pretty early example of post-hardcore and the aggressiveness and the angularity of the riffs and what have you. Post-hardcore as a genre has been massively influential to the development of not only just punk rock, but music itself, as it relates to both underground and mainstream taste, influencing the development of genres like grunge, sludge metal, emo, mallcore, metalcore, Riot Girl. I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but I'm going to put it down below so people know what I'm talking about. Is Shimoketake, Scrams, otherwise known as like Original Screamo for you fucking nerds, Sass, Electronicore, Nintendo Core, Alternative Metal, Swancore, Math Rock, Neo Crust, all that shit. So, while those like late 70s bands could be considered like massively influential to the development of the sound, what a lot of people point to the beginnings of it, the first bands like in the genre would be Wipers, Minutemen, and Saccharine Trust. Wipers had a sound that was pretty close to post-punk at the time, with like the added like 80s Cold War nihilistic aggression that defined a lot of American hardcore in the early 80s. If you haven't heard Youth of America, that is one of the best punk albums of all time. You just gotta hear it. It's so good. It's interesting, these three bands really have very little in common, which in the 80s, as the genre was developing, and it, eventually branched into like different trains of thought with its sound, But at the time, there was a lot of just raw, like, experimentation of, like, bands just trying to, like, fit shit together, which, of course, like, still continues, but, like, a lot of people have come to know post-hardcore exclusively by the, like, mallcore, metalcore kind of, like, group of bands, which, you know, is, like, important to the story, and some folks will tell you that that's not, like, real post-hardcore or whatever. Like, I definitely thought that in high school because I was a fucking loser. But at any rate, Minutemen took their influence from more of the, like, dance punk, funk rock kind of groups like Talking Heads and, like, Devo. Saccharine Trust lent their sound a lot closer to the, like, gothic rock, death rock camp. And Wipers, honestly, some people, including myself, have, like, considered them important to the development of emo with their, introspective lyricism, and I don't want to say, like, emotional riffs, because, like, all the music has emotion, but there's definitely, like, that same sense of, like, grandiosity and, like, crescendo-ness to some of Wiper's stuff that would eventually influence the development of emo. More on that. Emo was also influenced by bands like Descendants, who on their album Milo Goes to College had a lot of songs that sound pretty similar to, like, what a lot of the Revolution summer groups in DC would go on to sound like. You had Husker Du, you had The Replacements, especially with the Kids Don't Follow EP. And then you also had, like, bands like the Smiths who, like, you know, aren't really, like, related to the American development, but nonetheless, like, influenced different, like, shades of what emo would become. But of all those bands, I'd say Husker Du was, like, the most important to the development of emo, but also was, like, heavily influential to post-hardcore as a whole. And I haven't done a lot of research on this, but I'd say, like, they probably helped define the movement. I don't really know when, like, this term came to be or anything like that. Like, I wasn't in the 80s. This is all going off, like, prior knowledge and research I've done in the past couple months. And, of course, like, years. But, you know, Husker Du had their debut Land Speed record, which, you know, had, like, moments outside of, like, normal hardcore, but for the most part, like, just was more within the confines of that genre's language. But on their EP Metal Circus, they started experimenting with these, like, really metallic and also, like, atmospheric, scratchy guitar tones. I don't know how the fuck they do that. Like, it sounds so cool. And they had, like, some pretty heavy subject matter and introspective lyrics. I hate that I keep saying that, but it's, like, it's pretty important as well, you know? And at the time, also, it's important to note that hardcore as a scene and American punk rock in general was very close-minded. There was a lot of, like, even, like, aggression at hearing stuff that, like, you know, people went there and they wanted to hear, like, a certain thing, and there was, like, violence sometimes at stuff like this. And of course it probably depended on the city and the crowd and whatever, but, you know, there's unfortunately, like, with a scene that prides itself on non-conformity, a lot of, like, conformity to that end group within that. I especially think of homophobia within the early 80s Los Angeles scene, and just the misogyny that was still pretty tied to punk. You can hear a lot of that in Descendants' early music and throughout their discography, but it's not whatever, though, you know? Like, fortunately, punk has really grown since then, and while you still see, like, a lot of, like, violence and close-mindedness, like, I'd say that we've come a far way towards, like, social understanding since the 80s. Also important to the early 80s development of post-hardcore was bands like Flipper, Fang, and them along with Black Flag started championing this really slow to a crawl hardcore style that was influenced by doom metal, like Black Sabbath at the time, and bands like Saint Vitus, who were, like, one of the few metal bands that were accepted within the punk scene. Them being on SST Records, which was Black Flag's label. I don't know if they owned it or just were like on it, but nonetheless, like a lot of like the disposition between punk and metal at the time was due to ideological difference and not necessarily because like they didn't like each other's music, because it did like crossbreed a lot during this time as well with the development of like thrash metal, death metal. But this video isn't about metal, it's about fucking punk rock. Right? Anyway, so, you know, these bands like influenced the development of sludge metal, and I recently read an anecdote about Greg Jen, the guitarist of Black Flag, being very protective over the recordings for My Work, because he didn't want any bands to rip it off, you know? But I found it, like, hilarious that, like, when this record dropped, like, it was received very poorly by the punk rock crowd. Like, they wanted to hear the aggression of Damage, like, the fucked upness. Like, they didn't want to hear these jazzy, crazy, like, technical playing that exhibits like the first half of that record and like the slow dirgy crawl of the second half. And if they hated that, like I wonder what punks thought of Family Man at the time, because that album is like wow, and it's good, but it's like it's crazy. But notably when Black Flag toured this album and they went like to the Northwest America, this really spoke to the peoples there. And it directly influenced the development of sludge metal and grunge that are intrinsically connected movements in the beginning. But specifically Melvins took this sound and like made like a whole career out of it, you know, adding, you know, different shit through the years. But, you know, Green River, Melvins, what other bands kind of exhibit this slowness? Because like I wouldn't say like all grunge bands are like that slow dirgy crawl, but they definitely have like that abrasive, noisy combination of punk and metal and like willingness to like be influenced by 70s hard rock as well. But yeah, I think that's interesting. So with emo, alongside Husker Du, you also had the bands that were directly influenced by them that included bands like The Hated, who sound crazy, and like how similar some of their stuff sounds to like late 90s emo pop, even like Midwest emo. Like I swear that like Words Come Back like could pass as a Get Up Kid song sometimes. And of course it still has like that 80s sound to it. Like the bass line's like this crazy jumping like do do diddle diddle do do diddle diddle do 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 diddle diddle do 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 diddle, you know? That like you don't hear that like sloppy characteristic as much like with the 90s emos bands, because a lot of them got too pretentious and too like serious about like you're not supposed to be serious about your art. Nah, it's not about that, but it's just I don't know. Okay, so let's get into Revolution Summer, right? Revolution Summer was a movement in Washington D.C. in the 80s. I'd say like mid-80s. I think this was specifically like the summer of 85 or 86, I could be wrong. But this was like pretty much the formation of emo-core at the time. There was a lot of like backlash from bands that didn't like the masculine like overtness of hardcore at the time and the area, the like machismo, the like misogyny, and started forming these bands that like while they were hardcore like dealt with more introspective topics and a lot of more delicate instrumentation that took a lot from Husker Du, but I think pushed it in like directions that enunciate the melodicism even further. So you know, during this time you had bands like Embrace and Rites of Spring and Fire Party, which had a woman vocalist, and I'm not sure if Grey Matter's from DC or not, but they're part of that movement. Marginal Man, Soulside, Beefeater, who, interestingly, Beefeater also exhibits early characteristics of funk metal. And I'll get into like the old alternative metal kind of thing later. The Hated, along with being like an early example of an emo band, also developed their sound after their first few EPs into a sound that, like, I would say is close to what Midwest emo would become later. And at the time, I've read that, like, publications referred to this shift in sound from them as REMO, you know, like the band REM, because of its, like, jangliness. And I think that's really interesting. Check out every song by The Hated. It's an album called Every Song. It's not like a retrospective compilation, interestingly enough. Another trend in sounds that I regret to inform you exist, for all you genre, like, deniers, like, you're gonna hate, like, some of the shit I say in this video. But there was a trend in sounds, even from the late 70s, called pig fuck, which has a very vulgar name that I regret to inform you exist. What it basically means is, like, these noisy, abrasive punk bands with, like, this edgy lyricism, sometimes stage antics in the case of Big Black. Bands in this movement could include No Trend, Big Black, the aforementioned Butthole Surfers, even Flippers sometimes included as part of this movement. Definitely, like, became more established by the 90s. You know, you had bands like Killdozer and Unsane. Shellac is somewhat relative to that movement, because they carried some of the edgy lyricism over from Albini's previous band, Big Black. This sound basically, like, exhibits a closeness to post-punk's skeletal structure while having noisy, abrasive guitar playing, sometimes a huge blues influence, which is interesting as well, especially in the case of bands like the Jesus Lizard. Alternative metal, while not inherently connected to post-hardcore, I think is an important thing to point out in the story. Of course, like, alternative rock is a branching out from punk rock into, like, more pop-centric structures that, you know, at first was bands like The Replacements, and even Husker Du was, like, pretty important to the development of that genre. But alternative metal took influence not only from alternative rock, but hardcore and post-hardcore. And I'd say one of the first bands to do it was Bad Brains, who on their album Eye Against Eye had these really, like, mid-tempo, palm muty, even kind of, like, close to groove metal and funk metal kind of riffage that would go on to, like, continue to influence the rest of alternative metal. And throughout the rest of post-hardcore's history, you definitely see strong overlap with these two genres. In the case of bands like Helmet, Unsane, and of course, you know, alternative metal went on to become funk metal and nu metal and rap metal that at times, and depending on the band, like, still has pretty close ties to the branching away from hardcore. You know, a lot of these bands are still influenced by hardcore and, like, exhibit that influence and experimentation pretty strongly. You know, you can hear this on stuff like Korn, Slipknot, like, just look around for it, you know. You'll hear it if your ears are out for it. Before we get out of the 80s, I think the last thing I want to talk about that started around this time was math rock and, like, brutal prog that took, like, weird time signatures and, like, a noisy dissonance and all this progressive rock attitude into punk rock. Bands like Blind Idiot God and later Breadwinner, Phantom Tollbooth, who, interestingly, I would consider Phantom Tollbooth to be predating the whole screamo sound that cropped up later in the early 90s. As the 80s progressed, there became, like, more willingness to experiment with progressive rock tendencies. As, you know, at first, like, punk rock was pretty opposed to, like, and was, you know, formed directly in opposition to the progressive rock movement with its, like, flashiness and, like, pompousness, as some people would say. But math rock and brutal prog branched out of post-hardcore and post-punk, at first with MX-80 sound, to introduce these elements to punk and take that into interesting places. You know, you had later bands like Breadwinner and Polvo, etc., etc. Okay, so that's the 80s. How post-hardcore did like influence some bands that would see mainstream success or close to it, like Replacements, for example. It was really the 90s when, you know, after Nirvana had blown the lid off the whole alternative movement, and labels started to look for, like, who would be the next Nirvana, who's gonna, like, you know, take this torch of, like, mainstream rock to new audiences. And they, Capitol Records, I think, even signed Melvins at the time, which is strange given their confrontational nature. And they didn't stay on there long also because of it, you know. But around this time, you really start to see post-hardcore becoming more in the public eye. This is what I would consider to be the third wave of post-hardcore, given, like, you know, the first wave, I'd say, is, like, the early 80s with, like, the formation of, like, some of the tenets of what the confines of this heavily contextual genre could be under, and some pretty wild experimentation, but also a closeness and proximity to the hardcore movement and some of the main sounds of that. So it branched out, but not too far yet. And then the late 80s, I'd say, is like the second wave, when it started to become more established and there was different pockets of sound and different, like, bands taking it to different extremes and doing a bunch of weird shit with it. But the third wave, I have considered for a long time to be the Renaissance, the golden age of post-hardcore. I'd say there's a lot of good bands from every era, but 90s post-hardcore just has a specialness to it. The sounds, the attitude, because it was just what the most happening thing was at the time, and punk rock and music, like, you know, because, like, it was just the influence, the ripple effect was felt, like, in a lot of different parts of rock music. You saw in this era the development of American post-rock with bands like Splint and Rodan and Bitch Magnet that took timbre and texture into heavy account, and this is of course opposed to, like, movements of post-rock and other countries, like, you know, in Canada there was a heavy emphasis on chamber music, you know, and the influence of that. But you had stuff like the Louisville Sound and the Chicago School, you know, the Louisville Sound being, like, bands like Slint and June of 44 that had the emphasis on, like, the timbres from, and then Chicago School that took more influence from jazz and kind of more loungy styles. But these bands, like, took math rock in a direction that was decidedly not very frenetic and more centric on, like, building atmospheres. Still came at it with this, like, aggression that was, you know, twice removed from hardcore at first. You also had, like, the second wave of emo starting in the early 90s, as bands started to move away from the strictly emo core sound and, you know, add in influences from math rock. And I'm not sure if, like, Cap'n Jazz and Sunny Day Real Estate was directly influenced by the Hated, but there was definitely, like, a commonality in, like, the arpeggiated guitar parts and the almost, like, post-rock emphasis on, like, atmosphere and chords that my bandmate even describes as, like, kind of like what jazz is, but for punk rock, you know? So throughout the 90s, like, you had the development of emo, bands like Jimmy Eat World, Pop Unknown, Mineral, Christie Front Drive, Get Up Kids, all this shit just, like, came to be what defined emo more than the original emo core sound. While, you know, there was a lot of crossbreeding at this time, emo core eventually started, like, becoming more and more of a underground thing, even in underground circles, interesting enough. I'd say the torch was carried most prominently by Screamo. You know, took this aggression that was included in emo-core to an extreme, you know, and I say like is honestly more hardcore than even hardcore punk usually is. And like the name would imply, a lot of people are screaming at the top of their lungs. There's a lot of like frenetic tempo changes that is borrowed from power violence, which is a branch of hardcore punk. Screamo was started in the early 90s by bands like Heroin, Iconoclast, Ivik, Mohinder, but its heyday, its golden age, would be probably the late 90s. And probably the revival happening right now is pretty important as well. There's a lot of these bands from the late 90s that are pretty prominent right now and like having comebacks and doing festival appearances and new albums that are more acclaimed than even their original material. But, you know, digressing, you had bands like Jerome's Dream and Page 99, Orchid, Love Lost But Not Forgotten crop up in the late 90s. In the mid-90s, you saw the development of emo pop. There are bands like Jim Eat World and Get Up Kids. Jim Eat World famously being Blink-182's favorite emo band and what influenced them to become more whiny throughout the years and less like soften work with their comedy, at least with their studio material as they came into their self-titled album and such. As these sounds started coalescing, I'd say especially the crossbreeding of emo pop, screamo, and metalcore, you started seeing bands like Grade and Keepsake form that would become the foundation of mallcore in the 2000s, which, you know, is notable for like the melodic death metal, melodic metalcore kind of guitar playing, vocal passages that swap between screaming and singing or screaming and singing at the same time in different places, but having that like clean, unclean vocal mismatch that was massively popular in the 2000s, but I'll get to that after the 90s. Also in the 90s, you saw more of the development of these bands that were like hearkening closer and closer to like mainstream alternative rock. And some of these even saw some like chart success. Like Far and Jawbox are two examples that come to mind immediately. Bands that had like pretty much pop songwriting and like could be considered post-hardcore, but like it's as interesting, like I said like way earlier in the video, that like some of these bands like could only really be considered that because of their proximity and contextual inclusion to the movement of punk rock rather than like sounding anything close like hardcore punk. Like Jawbox like doesn't really sound like any of the early hardcore bands, but like if you like put them in the movement of what like post-hardcore sounded like in the 90s and where they got their influence from, what like informed some of their instrumentation, they're a post-hardcore band, even if they like harken closer in orbit to alternative rock. You also saw Riot Grrrl and the closely associated queercore, though that's decidedly less informed by the sound, I would say, than Riot Grrrl is. But there was a lot of overlap in the bands, like Team Dresch and Longstocking. And of course, like many of the Riot Grrrl bands were made up of queer people. That kind of was like informed by grunge and post-hardcore and took like this aggression that came out of like feminism and wanting to like carve a place where femme people could be represented within the largely man's world of punk rock at the time. That, you know, the world is, it's the fucking patriarchy. Like it's there's still like problems like this, even if there's like more diversity and the kinds of bands we'll see nowadays. Like there's still problems for sure, and like bands getting representation. But within Riot Grrrl, you had bands like Heavens to Betsy, which featured Corin Tucker, the one that was on Portlandia. You had Bikini Kill, Team Dresch, like I mentioned, Longstocking, Babes in Toyland. L7 is sometimes considered part of that movement. I want to also like talk about the development of straight up hardcore during this time. because I think that's interesting, like the overlap and the influence and whatever, given that, like, at the time there was a lot of like melodic hardcore and metalcore that kind of like almost like took the influence from post-hardcore back into hardcore and then went right around to like influence it back with like metalcore and other branchings off of that, like electronic core, whatever, like Nintendo core that came out of metalcore later on. But it's interesting, Converge, like in their early material, like I've heard people compare to like emo Slayer because it takes like equal parts from like Boston hardcore and thrash metal and like emo core of the time. You also saw bands that really like rode the lines between these genres, like hot water music that could be considered pretty close to melodic hardcore and emo core at the same time. And they later became like pretty emblematic of like a sound known as like orgcore that has to do with like really gruff kind of cigarette stained vocals and like kind of a pop punkish kind of appeal that's named because of this website punknews.org that pretty heavily featured these kind of bands and had a lot of proximity towards the Fest in Gainesville, Florida, which is a festival, if you couldn't guess, that showcases a lot of this type of band. Also included to be like the Lawrence Arms and some of Against Me's stuff. I'm not sure if Leatherface could be considered part of that or not, given that I think they're British. But nonetheless, yeah, Boy Sets Fire. One last thing before the 90s is over is I want to mention something that's only a little bit related, but like I still think it's still kind of important to note, and it's just interesting to me in general. Is the development of post metal, as it came from like a few different camps, but like originally coalesced with this band called Neurosis that, after their first two albums that were pretty heavily informed by crust punk and the second album by post-hardcore, on their third album championed the sound that came to be defined as post-metal. That pretty much features a lot of like atmospheric, sometimes like doom metal influence, sometimes like post-rock influence, progressive metal influence, and kind of melds it into like what could be considered like the metal equivalent of post-rock. And Neurosis like displays a lot of post-hardcore influences early on and to their work that later like became less refined as they like harkened closer and closer to straight up metal. But there's a few post-metal bands that I would say like are pretty connected to that, including Tool, interestingly. Including Tool. Alright, I could like keep doing this forever if I got into 2010s and 2020s material, but I kind of just want to stop at the 2000s because there's just way too much. There's just way too many like for one, like a lot of the bands in the 2010s and this decade aren't doing as much development anymore as they're doing like continuous like revivalism and novel genre combinations, which is interesting in its own right. But the only thing before I talk about 2000s material that I want to mention about like the next 2 decades is fifth wave emo. And fifth wave emo is a sound that is pretty hard, if not impossible, to define, that has to do with a lot of bedroom producers, especially in the early part of this decade. But later, and even then, like bands and different stuff that took like this, pretty much like, that took this experimentation, in the case of bands like Hey I Love You or Your Arms Are My Cocoon, into what had previously been done with the emo movement, It's like crazy what some of these bands can sound like. A lot of them like are pretty far removed from emo in the first place and have this like thing that I think is like pretty prominent this decade of like reinterpreting and deconstructing like Y2K aesthetics and symbology into like this like coalescing of like the best parts of it and like stuff that was never included in the 2000s in general and all this stuff that I think is like really interesting as a person that like lived throughout that decade and remember some of it. I don't remember 9/11 though. It's okay. It was really interesting to follow this movement as I was on Twitter starting in 2021 because, like, you know, you saw a lot of these bands blow up as, like, lockdown restrictions stopped being in place. And blow up, like, in the sense of, like, being able to tour and play live shows and getting record deals and all this shit. I forgot to mention this earlier, but this band on my shirt is also a fifth wave emo band. Echo Beauty Terror, who make what they've labeled as Scrams Pop. It's basically just David playing piano really whimsically and virtuistic, and Amber screaming their head off in front of the keyboards. And it's fantastic, and you should see them live if you can. EBT, formerly known as Echo Beauty Terror, I think that it might be kind of ambiguous, I'm not really sure. But yeah, check them out. Let's go back into the 2000s now, though. So there's really only 3 trains of thought that I really think are super important to tackle from this decade, which are nonetheless, like, very important ones. See, when you mention post-hardcore to, like, most people, I'd imagine that they think you're talking about bands from this era, given, like, the almost ubiquitous connection of the popularity of the sound to exclusively the mallcore movement that, you know, started in the very late 90s with bands like Great and Keepsake, like I mentioned, but started to really form with bands like Finch and Alexis on Fire and My Chemical Romance that, you know, took that like clean singing, unclean singing approach and a lot of theatricalness to it, especially in the case of My Chemical Romance and Fall Out Boy, though I consider only like a few of their songs to be connected to that movement. They're very much, they're a lot closer to just straight up emo pop. Super popular. I'd say, like, it's even, like, pretty apparent in my DNA from, like, growing up as a kid in the 2000s, like, hearing commercials and having, like, instrumental post-hardcore on, or, like, seeing, like, Cartoon Network bumps, and, like, you know, it was just kind of, like, one of the heavy trains of sound in that decade. Alongside emo pop, which was, like, pretty intrinsically connected, those two scenes. Under Oath as well, you know, and a lot of these bands were also, like, pretty tied to the metalcore movement at the time, which was, I think, like, the second or third wave of metalcore. According to a friend, I'd have to, like, ask her, but that's not my place. Metalcore is not, like, my forte. I like a lot of it, but, like, it's not something I hyperfixate on, like, the larger movement of post-hardcore. So, alongside mallcore, you also had sass, that started around the mid-90s with bands like Swing Kids and Antioch Arrow and the Dismemberment Plan, that was kind of characterized by like a flamboyantness, like a homoeroticism, this like angular like post-punk new wave influence like tied back into screamo, with like a lot of synthesizer sometimes, some like crazy riffs with like a lot of the like pull-offs. Bring it up, bring it up. Demonstration of a pull-off. You get the idea. But, you know, in the 2000s you started seeing this like become more refined as a movement, especially with bands like the Blood Brothers and These Arms Are Snakes, the Blood Brothers, like, getting popular enough to appear on late night television shows and stuff, you know. You know, like, I would consider, like, the 90s still to be, like, the renaissance of post-hardcore, like, the golden age, but, like, the 2000s, like, you saw this experimentation, the mainstream appeal go into new heights and levels, and bands doing all sorts of shit, you know, as it became, like, something that more and more people were aware of, you know. You saw, like, bands start to experiment heavily with synthesizers in the case of bands like Enter Shikari and Horse the Band and Attack Attack. And the other side of SAS is like a movement like known as like white belt grind, where bands took like, you know, this like dancey new wave whatever homoeroticism, the like especially like the vocal style, you know, it's like kind of shit, and to like, you know, heavier styles like including like metalcore and grindcore bands like especially the Number 12 Looks Like You. You also had bands included in this movement called Swancore that I think it's fucked up that it's named after like the guitarist of Dance Gavin Dance, given that like they weren't even the first band to like do this style, but whatever. That's just like my own personal caveat. But this movement sees like the high register vocals taken from like emo pop added alongside like progressive, like super technical playing and song structures that was originally influenced by At the Drive-In, and as they became Mars Volta especially, this kind of like heavily progressive math rocky kind of like playing style with this like theatricalness. Even like some of Pierce the Veil stuff could be considered part of this movement. So that's my video on post-hardcore. I hope it was okay. This is my first time doing a video essay like this, and I hope that y'all enjoyed it. If you want to hear me talk about any other kind of genres or music stuff, like I know a lot more than just this, and I'd like to maybe even possibly like delve further into like different stuff I talked about today, because this was kind of like a less comprehensive overview of the genres. I wanted to just like talk about as much as I could. But yeah, just like leave some comments, let me know what you think, like if you want me to talk about whatever else, like I don't know. I know about electronic music too and industrial music, I don't know. I know a lot of shit. Just yeah, you know, keep it real.